The emergency session of the Privy Council convened at Buckingham Palace just 6 hours after the extraordinary events at Westminster Abbey had shocked the nation and the world. King Charles III sat at the head of the ancient oak table, his face bearing the weight of decisions that would define his reign and potentially reshape the relationship between the crown and the military establishment. Home Secretary Patricia Westbrook presented the preliminary findings from Detective Chief Inspector Morrison's investigation, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was reporting. The evidence discovered in General Thornfield's coffin painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and military command, spanning multiple administrations and involving billions of pounds in illegal arms deals. "Your Majesty," she said, placing a bound dossier before the king. "The documentation is extensive and appears to be authentic." General Thornfield spent at least 18 months compiling evidence that implicates serving ministers, senior military officers, and defense contractors in activities that violate both British law and international treaties. Attorney General Sir Robert Hammond reviewed the legal implications with characteristic precision, his decades of experience in constitutional law brought to bear on an unprecedented situation. The Crown's position in such circumstances required careful navigation between constitutional duty, legal obligation, and political reality. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison had been summoned to provide a first-hand account of the investigation's progress, her professional composure masking the exhaustion from what had already been the most challenging day of her career. The evidence processing had revealed layer upon layer of corruption that seemed to implicate officials from multiple government departments. Captain James Sullivan stood at attention as he recounted his final conversations with General Thornfield, the letter he had been entrusted to deliver, and his growing understanding of his commanding officer's motivations. The general's decision to use his own funeral as the stage for this revelation now appeared to be the culmination of a carefully planned operation spanning months. The recordings found among the evidence had been partially transcribed, revealing conversations that discussed arms sales to regimes under international sanctions, the manipulation of intelligence reports to justify military operations, and systematic cover-ups of civilian casualties during recent conflicts. The voices on the recordings included several individuals present in the palace at that very moment. Defense Secretary Michael Crawford faced the uncomfortable reality that his department was at the center of the allegations, with evidence suggesting that the corruption extended back through several previous administrations. His own tenure appeared to be compromised by decisions made by predecessors, but the political damage would inevitably fall upon the current government. King Charles listened to each briefing with the measured attention that had characterized his approach to constitutional monarchy throughout his reign. The evidence presented to him required responses that balanced his role as head of state with his duty to ensure that British institutions maintained their integrity and public trust. "Gentlemen and lady," the king said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades preparing for moments like this. "We face circumstances that test the very foundations of our democratic institutions. The evidence presented demands action, regardless of the political consequences or personal relationships involved." Lady Margaret Thornfield had been brought to the palace at her own request, seeking answers about her husband's final actions and the circumstances that had led him to orchestrate such a dramatic revelation. Her composure had returned, replaced by a steely determination to see her husband's final mission completed honorably. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner briefed the assembled officials on the security implications of the investigation, noting that several individuals named in the evidence had already been placed under discreet surveillance. The potential for document destruction or witness intimidation required immediate protective measures. Colonel Richard Pemberton provided military context for the allegations, explaining how the systems and procedures compromised by the corruption had affected operational effectiveness and military morale. His 40-year career gave weight to his assessment that the scandal threatened to undermine public trust in the armed forces themselves. Archbishop William Hartley attended the emergency session in his capacity as a senior member of the establishment, bringing perspective on the spiritual and moral dimensions of the crisis. The use of Westminster Abbey for General Thornfield's revelation had created theological questions about the proper relationship between earthly justice and divine sanctuary. The Prime Minister participated via secure video link from his constituency, having been briefed on the developing situation while traveling. His political calculations had to balance the immediate need for damage control with the long-term requirement to restore institutional credibility through genuine reform. Foreign Secretary Diana Ashworth outlined the international implications of the revelations, noting that several allied governments had already made discreet inquiries about the potential impact on ongoing defense cooperation agreements. The scandal threatened to undermine Britain's standing within NATO and other international security arrangements. Detective Sergeant Michael Crawford coordinated with intelligence services to assess whether the corruption identified by General Thornfield's evidence represented active security threats or had been confined to financial irregularities. The distinction would determine both the scope of the investigation and the urgency of various protective measures. King Charles requested individual consultations with each senior official, seeking to understand both the factual basis of the allegations and the constitutional options available for addressing them. His conversations with each participant revealed the complexity of separating personal loyalties from institutional responsibilities. The evidence suggested that General Thornfield had first approached normal oversight channels with his concerns, only to discover that the corruption extended into those very institutions. His decision to orchestrate the funeral revelation appeared to have been motivated by frustration with the failure of conventional accountability mechanisms. Captain Sullivan presented additional materials that the general had entrusted to him, including detailed financial records that traced money flows between defense contractors and offshore accounts controlled by serving officials. The sophistication of the financial arrangements indicated professional assistance in structuring the corrupt payments. The Royal Private Secretary coordinated with government communications specialists to prepare public statements that would acknowledge the seriousness of the situation while maintaining confidence in British institutions. The unprecedented nature of the scandal required careful messaging to prevent broader damage to democratic governance. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison reported that several key witnesses had already been interviewed, with more scheduled for the following days. The cooperation level varied significantly, with some officials providing full assistance, while others had already retained legal representation and declined to answer questions. The Cabinet Secretary participated by secure telephone, coordinating government responses while managing the immediate political fallout from revelations that threatened to bring down the current administration. The constitutional precedents for such situations provided limited guidance for the scale and scope of the current crisis. Security arrangements for the ongoing investigation required coordination between multiple agencies, with concerns about evidence tampering, witness safety, and the potential for additional revelations that might compound the current crisis. The general's methodical approach to documenting corruption suggested that more surprises might emerge. Lady Margaret's testimony provided crucial insights into her husband's mental state and motivations during his final months, revealing a man driven by conscience to expose wrongdoing despite personal and professional costs. Her support for the investigation added moral authority to the pursuit of accountability. The legal framework for prosecuting the allegations required careful consideration of national security implications, with some evidence potentially too sensitive for public court proceedings. Special procedures for handling classified material in criminal cases would need to be implemented on an unprecedented scale. King Charles made the decision to authorize a full royal commission of inquiry, granting investigative powers that exceeded normal police authority while ensuring that the investigation remained independent of political interference. The commission would have access to classified materials and the authority to compel testimony from senior officials. International cooperation became essential as the investigation revealed connections to arms dealers and financial institutions in multiple countries. Diplomatic channels were activated to ensure that evidence located overseas could be properly secured and examined. The general's final letter to Captain Sullivan contained specific instructions for handling the evidence and ensuring that the investigation remained focused on accountability rather than political advantage. His concern for institutional integrity remained paramount even as he exposed the corruption within those same institutions. Public reaction to the unfolding scandal ranged from shock and anger to demands for immediate resignations, and prosecutions. The dramatic circumstances of the revelation at Westminster Abbey had captured public attention in ways that conventional whistleblowing might not have achieved. Military morale required careful management, as serving personnel struggled to process allegations that their senior leadership had betrayed fundamental principles of military service. The honor guard who had witnessed the coffin opening became symbols of institutional integrity amid the surrounding corruption. The investigation timeline stretched ahead with the promise of months or years of detailed examination of complex financial and operational records. The general's documentation provided roadmaps for inquiry, but verification and legal proceedings would require extensive additional work. King Charles concluded the emergency session with a commitment to see the investigation through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal or political consequences for those involved. His statement emphasized that the Crown's duty to the people required unflinching pursuit of truth and accountability, even when it challenged comfortable assumptions about institutional integrity. The sun had set over London by the time the Privy Council session concluded, but the investigation that began with a funeral coffin's unexpected opening had only just begun. The general's final mission would continue long after his earthly service had ended, carried forward by those committed to honoring his sacrifice through genuine accountability and reform. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Morrison's hands trembled slightly as she carefully photographed the contents of the now open coffin. The sacred silence of Westminster Abbey had been replaced by the urgent whispers of police officers and the distant sound of sirens growing closer. What she saw before her challenged everything she thought she knew about proper funeral procedures and military protocol. The documents scattered inside the ornate casket appeared to be authentic Ministry of Defense files, each marked with the highest levels of security classification. Alongside them lay what appeared to be audio recording devices, USB drives, and photographs that even at first glance suggested a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of government and military command. King Charles approached the altar with measured steps, his security detail maintaining a protective formation around him. His face remained composed, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands clasped behind his back with unusual force. The monarch had witnessed many shocking moments during his years of public service, but nothing had prepared him for this unprecedented breach of protocol and decorum. "Your Majesty," Detective Chief Inspector Morrison said quietly, turning toward the king while maintaining her position near the evidence. "We need to secure this area immediately and begin a formal investigation. These appear to be classified documents, and their presence here suggests this was a planned operation rather than any kind of supernatural occurrence." Captain James Sullivan stepped forward, his military bearing intact despite the shock written across his features. "Ma'am, Detective Chief Inspector, I believe I may have information relevant to this situation. General Thornfield spoke to me privately during his final weeks, and his words now seem to carry significance I didn't understand at the time." The honor guard, still maintaining their positions despite the chaos, looked to their senior non-commissioned officer for guidance. Sergeant Major William Hayes, a 30-year veteran who had served under General Thornfield in 3 different theaters of operation, took charge of maintaining order among the military personnel while allowing the civilian authorities to investigate. Lady Margaret Thornfield had been escorted to a private chapel within the abbey, where she was being comforted by family members and receiving medical attention for shock. Her initial scream had given way to quiet sobbing as the reality of the situation began to settle in. The woman who thought she was burying her beloved husband was now confronted with evidence that his death had been orchestrated to reveal secrets that could shake the foundations of the government. Archbishop William Hartley moved among the congregation, attempting to provide spiritual comfort while coordinating with security personnel to manage the crowd. The ancient abbey had hosted kings and queens, witnessed coronations, and state funerals, but nothing in its history compared to the drama unfolding within its sacred walls. Detective Sergeant Michael Crawford, Morrison's longtime partner, arrived with the first wave of Metropolitan Police reinforcements. His practiced eye immediately assessed the scene, noting the positions of key witnesses and beginning the process of securing evidence that could prove crucial to understanding what had transpired. "Sarah," he said quietly, approaching his superior, "we've got media vans surrounding the entire block, and the commissioner is en route personally. This is going to be the highest profile investigation either of us has ever handled." The television cameras that had been broadcasting what they expected to be a solemn funeral ceremony were now capturing something unprecedented in British history. News anchors struggled to explain what they were witnessing, while social media exploded with speculation and conspiracy theories that ranged from the plausible to the completely absurd. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the royal family's personal physician, arrived to attend to any medical needs arising from the shock of the revelation. Her calm professionalism provided a steady presence as she moved between family members and dignitaries who were struggling to process what they had witnessed. Colonel Richard Pemberton approached Captain Sullivan, his weathered face grave with concern and growing understanding. "James, what exactly did the general tell you in those final conversations? I'm beginning to think Marcus planned this entire scenario. And if that's true, we need to understand why he felt such drastic measures were necessary." The USB drives and recording equipment found in the coffin suggested that General Thornfield had spent considerable time documenting whatever information he felt compelled to reveal. The technical sophistication of the devices indicated planning and preparation that must have taken months, if not longer, to arrange. Home Secretary Patricia Westbrook arrived at Westminster Abbey with her own security detail, her face reflecting the gravity of a situation that threatened to become a national security crisis. The presence of classified documents at such a public venue, in front of international media and foreign dignitaries, created diplomatic implications that extended far beyond British borders. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison carefully bagged each piece of evidence while maintaining detailed photographic documentation of their positions within the coffin. Her years of experience had taught her that the arrangement and presentation of evidence often told as important a story as the contents themselves. King Charles requested a private consultation with the senior investigating officers, understanding that his role as monarch required him to be briefed on any matters that might affect national security. The constitutional implications of whatever revelations lay ahead would need to be carefully considered and managed. "Detective Chief Inspector," the king said quietly, "I want you to know that you have my complete support in this investigation. Whatever truth General Thornfield felt compelled to reveal, it must be thoroughly examined and properly handled. The integrity of our institutions depends on it." Captain Sullivan produced a letter from his uniform pocket, sealed and marked with the general's personal insignia. "He gave me this 3 days before he died, with instructions to open it only if something unexpected happened at his funeral. I think we can safely say this qualifies as unexpected." The letter, written in General Thornfield's distinctive handwriting, provided the first concrete explanation for the extraordinary events unfolding at Westminster Abbey. Its contents revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command and government oversight, involving arms deals, intelligence operations, and cover-ups that spanned multiple administrations. Detective Sergeant Crawford coordinated with forensic specialists who had arrived to process the scene, ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly collected and documented. The chain of custody would be crucial if any prosecutions emerged from whatever investigation lay ahead. The congregation, initially shocked into silence, began to murmur as the reality of the situation became apparent. Foreign diplomats quietly consulted with their security details, while British officials tried to manage a crisis that was already spinning beyond their control. Colonel Pemberton read portions of the general's letter aloud to Captain Sullivan, his voice growing tighter with each revelation. The document outlined systematic corruption within defense procurement processes, illegal arms sales to questionable regimes, and the cover-up of war crimes that had occurred during recent military operations. "My God," Pemberton whispered, "he's documented everything. Names, dates, amounts, locations. This isn't just accusations, it's a complete intelligence dossier." The audio recordings found in the coffin contained conversations between high-ranking officials discussing the very activities outlined in the written documentation. The general had apparently spent months secretly recording meetings and phone calls, building an irrefutable case against those he believed had betrayed their oaths of service. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison realized that what had begun as a funeral disturbance had evolved into something that would likely require the establishment of a special investigation unit. The scope of the allegations and the seniority of those potentially implicated meant that normal police procedures would be insufficient. Sergeant Major Hayes gathered the honor guard together, speaking quietly but firmly about their duty to maintain professional standards regardless of the chaos surrounding them. "The general chose us to be here for a reason," he told them. "Our job now is to ensure his final mission is completed with the same precision he demanded in life." The medical examiner's office received urgent instructions to re-examine the circumstances of General Thornfield's death, which had been attributed to natural causes following a brief illness. The sophisticated planning evident in the funeral revelation suggested that his passing might not have been as straightforward as initially believed. Lady Margaret was brought back to the main chapel once she had recovered sufficiently from the initial shock. Her family rallied around her as she struggled to comprehend that her husband's final act had been to expose corruption that could bring down the government he had served for 4 decades. Archbishop Hartley consulted with senior church officials about the unprecedented situation, seeking guidance on how to handle sacred space that had become a crime scene. The spiritual implications of using a house of worship for such revelations weighed heavily on his conscience. The photographs found among the evidence showed meetings between defense officials and arms dealers in locations that should have been off-limits to such activities. Timestamps and location data embedded in the digital files provided verification that would be difficult to dispute or dismiss. Detective Sergeant Crawford established a secure communication line with Scotland Yard's Special Investigations Unit, briefing them on the preliminary findings while requesting additional resources for what was clearly going to be a complex and sensitive investigation. King Charles received regular updates from his private secretary, who coordinated with government officials to manage the constitutional aspects of the unfolding crisis. The monarch's role in such circumstances was carefully prescribed, but the unprecedented nature of the situation required careful navigation of uncharted territory. The international media presence meant that whatever emerged from the investigation would be scrutinized not just nationally, but globally. Allied governments were already making discreet inquiries about the implications for ongoing defense cooperation and intelligence sharing arrangements. Captain Sullivan found himself at the center of the investigation as the general's chosen messenger, the person entrusted with ensuring that the final revelation was properly handled. The weight of that responsibility pressed upon him as he realized that his actions in the coming hours and days would help determine whether his commanding officer's sacrifice had meaning. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Westminster Abbey remained sealed while investigators methodically processed evidence that promised to reshape understanding of recent military and political history. The funeral had become a catalyst for revelations that would echo through the corridors of power for years to come. The morning mist clung to Westminster Abbey like a shroud as hundreds of mourners gathered for what should have been a solemn farewell to General Sir Marcus Thornfield, one of Britain's most decorated military officers. The Gothic spires pierced the grey London sky, their ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of royal ceremonies and state occasions. Today, however, would mark something unprecedented in the Abbey's 1,000-year history. King Charles III adjusted his military dress uniform one final time before stepping from the royal car. The weight of the moment pressed upon his shoulders as heavily as the ceremonial sword at his side. General Thornfield had been more than a military leader. He had been a personal friend, a confidant who had served the crown with unwavering loyalty through 4 decades of service. The king's weathered face, marked by years of duty and recent grief, reflected the solemnity befitting such an occasion. Inside the abbey, the atmosphere was thick with emotion and reverence. Military personnel from across the Commonwealth stood at attention, their uniforms pristine, their faces masks of professional composure. The general's widow, Lady Margaret Thornfield, sat in the front pew, her black veil trembling slightly as she fought back tears. Her children flanked her, their own grief evident despite their attempts to maintain the stoic dignity their father would have expected. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Morrison positioned herself strategically near the altar, her trained eyes scanning the congregation for any signs of disturbance. At 42, she had seen enough state funerals to know that such high-profile events attracted all manner of attention, not all of it welcome. The Metropolitan Police had received several anonymous threats in the days leading up to the ceremony, though none had been deemed credible enough to postpone the proceedings. The coffin, draped in the Union Jack and adorned with the general's medals and ceremonial sword, rested on a gun carriage near the altar. The honor guard, composed of soldiers from the general's former regiment, stood motionless at each corner, their rifles held in perfect position. The morning light filtering through the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the polished wood, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. Archbishop William Hartley approached the pulpit, his robes rustling softly in the hushed silence. He had known General Thornfield personally, having served as military chaplain during several overseas deployments. The weight of delivering the eulogy for such a remarkable man was not lost on him. As he began to speak, his voice carried clearly through the vaulted space, reaching every corner of the packed abbey. We gather today not in despair, but in celebration of a life lived in service to crown and country. The Archbishop intoned, his words measured and reverent. General Sir Marcus Thornfield embodied the finest traditions of the British military, leading by example and never asking of his soldiers what he would not do himself. In the gallery above, members of the press captured every moment, their cameras clicking softly as they documented what they believed would be a standard, if emotionally charged, military funeral. Television crews broadcast the proceedings live to millions of viewers across the nation and Commonwealth, unaware that they were about to witness something that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Captain James Sullivan, the general's former aide-de-camp, stood rigidly among the military contingent, his mind wandering to memories of his commanding officer. He recalled the general's final words to him just 3 weeks earlier, spoken from his hospital bed with characteristic directness. "James, remember that honor is not just about how we live, but how we ensure the truth survives us." At the time, Sullivan had assumed it was simply the philosophical musings of a dying man. Now, those words seemed to carry a weight he hadn't initially understood. The ceremony proceeded according to ancient protocol, each element carefully choreographed and rehearsed. The choir's voices soared through traditional hymns, their harmonies creating an atmosphere of transcendent beauty. Military officers read passages from scripture with precision and dignity, while family members shared personal remembrances that painted a picture of a man who was as devoted to his family as he was to his duty. Lady Margaret rose shakily to deliver her tribute, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke of her husband's gentle nature at home, so different from his commanding presence in uniform. She described quiet evenings when he would read to their grandchildren, his stern military bearing melting away to reveal the tender heart beneath. The congregation listened in respectful silence, many moved to tears by her courage in speaking publicly during such a difficult time. As the formal proceedings continued, Detective Chief Inspector Morrison noticed subtle signs of unease among some of the military personnel. Sideways glances, slight shifts in posture, the kind of body language that suggested knowledge of something beyond the immediate ceremony. Her instincts, honed by 20 years in law enforcement, told her that not everyone present was there simply to pay their respects. The morning progressed without incident, each element of the service unfolding as planned. Prayers were offered, lessons read, and military traditions observed with precision that would have made the general proud. The pipe major from the general's Scottish regiment stepped forward to play a haunting lament, the mournful notes of the bagpipes echoing through the ancient stones and touching hearts throughout the assembled mourners. Colonel Richard Pemberton, the general's longtime friend and fellow officer, delivered the military tribute with characteristic brevity and power. He spoke of operations in distant lands, of decisions made under impossible pressure, of a leader who never lost sight of the human cost of warfare. His words painted a picture of a soldier's soldier, a man who earned respect through deed rather than declaration. As the formal eulogies concluded, the congregation prepared for the final blessing and the the processional that would accompany the coffin to its final resting place in the Abbey's military section. The honor guard stepped forward, preparing to shoulder their solemn burden. The pipe major began the opening notes of the regimental march, a tune that had accompanied the general through countless ceremonies during his illustrious career. King Charles rose from his seat, preparing to follow the coffin as royal protocol demanded. His face reflected the gravity of the moment and the personal loss he felt at the passing of a trusted advisor and friend. Around him, the congregation began to stand, ready to pay their final respects as the general's earthly remains were carried from the sacred space. It was then, in that moment of transition between the formal service and the final farewell, that Detective Chief Inspector Morrison noticed a figure moving through the shadows near the back of the Abbey. Her hand instinctively moved toward her radio as she watched the individual's purposeful movement toward the altar area. Something in the person's bearing suggested urgency rather than reverence, determination rather than grief. The honor guard had just positioned themselves around the coffin when the first tremor ran through the ornate wooden casket. Initially dismissed as a trick of light or the settling of the gun carriage, the movement became more pronounced, causing several guards to exchange uncertain glances. The pipe major's music faltered slightly as attention focused on the unexpected disturbance. A collective gasp arose from the congregation as the coffin lid began to shift visibly. What had started as barely perceptible movement became undeniable reality as the heavy wooden cover started to open. The honor guard stepped back in confusion, their training having prepared them for many contingencies, but not for this unprecedented situation. Lady Margaret's scream pierced the air as the coffin continued to open, her composure finally shattered by this impossible development. The sound echoed through the vaulted space, joined by gasps and exclamations of shock from throughout the congregation. Several people rose from their seats, unsure whether to flee or remain frozen in disbelief. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison immediately activated her radio, calling for backup while pushing through the crowd toward the altar. Her mind raced through possible explanations, from elaborate hoax to something far more sinister. The security implications of such an incident at a state funeral in the presence of the monarch were staggering. King Charles remained remarkably composed, his years of public service and military training allowing him to maintain dignity even in the face of the extraordinary. His protection detail moved closer, their hands positioned near their weapons while their eyes scanned for potential threats. The carefully orchestrated ceremony had dissolved into chaos, but the king's steady presence provided an anchor of calm amid the storm. The coffin lid continued its inexorable movement, revealing glimpses of the interior that should have contained the general's earthly remains. Instead of the expected sight of their fallen comrade, the honor guard found themselves staring into what appeared to be an empty casket, save for official documents and what looked like recording equipment. Captain Sullivan pushed through the crowd, his face pale with recognition and growing understanding. The general's final words echoed in his mind with new meaning as he realized that his commanding officer's last mission had been to expose a truth so significant that it required this dramatic revelation. The man who had spent his life serving his country had chosen to use his own funeral as the stage for his final act of service. Archbishop Hartley attempted to restore order, his voice calling for calm, while his own mind struggled to comprehend what was unfolding before the altar. The sacred space, consecrated for worship and ceremony, had become the setting for something that defied all precedent and protocol. As police sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder as emergency vehicles approached Westminster Abbey, the congregation remained transfixed by the open coffin and its shocking contents. Television cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the unprecedented scene to a worldwide audience that watched in stunned silence. The morning mist outside had given way to pale sunshine, but inside the Abbey, the light seemed different now, charged with tension and uncertainty. What had begun as a celebration of a life well lived had transformed into something that would change everything for those present and for the nation itself. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison reached the altar area just as the coffin fully opened, revealing documents that appeared to contain information of the highest classification. Her trained eye immediately recognized the potential significance of what lay before them, and she knew that the investigation about to begin would test every skill she had developed during her career. The general's final revelation was only beginning to unfold, and already it was clear that nothing about this day would be forgotten by those who witnessed it. History was being written in real time within the ancient walls of Westminster Abbey, and the consequences would ripple far beyond this moment of shocking discovery.